when 7-year-old Maya Chen whispered, "I can help fix that," to Marcus Sterling's dead $500,000 Rolls-Royce Phantom. The arrogant CEO of Sterling Luxury Motors had no idea he was speaking to the actual majority owner of his own empire. Little girl whose late grandfather had secretly structured a trust that would transfer control of his automotive kingdom to his granddaughter on her 8th birthday. Still weeks away. As Maya's tiny hands worked miracles on the luxury engine that had stumped Sterling's best engineers, her repair would trigger a chain of revelations that would expose decades of corporate theft, ignite a legal battle that threatened to destroy the only family she had left, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Before we dive deeper, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have something truly extraordinary waiting for you. The September morning fog rolled across Harbor View in Seattle like a blanket over the small neighborhood's struggling dreams. Rose Chen turned the rusty key in the weathered door of Chen's auto repair, her weathered fingers trembling with the arthritis that had made simple tasks increasingly difficult. At 68, she carried the overwhelming weight of raising her granddaughter alone, a burden made heavier by the financial struggles that had consumed them since her husband David's death 2 years ago. "Come on, little one," Rose called softly to the small figure curled up in the passenger seat of their 12-year-old Toyota Camry. "Time to get ready for school." Maya stretched and rubbed her sleepy eyes, her black hair sticking up at random angles from sleeping against the car window. She had spent another night at the garage because their apartment's electricity had been shut off again, and Rose couldn't bear to see her granddaughter shiver through another cold Seattle night. The child's school uniform was wrinkled from being slept in, but it was clean. Rose made sure of that, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. "Can I stay here today, Grandma?" Maya asked, her voice small and hopeful. "I promise. I'll be really quiet while you work." Rose's heart ached as she watched her granddaughter gather her worn backpack, the one with the carefully patched holes and faded Disney characters that had seen better days since David's death, followed by the legal battles that had stripped them of everything: the house, the savings, even David's precious workshop. Maya had become far too familiar with adult worries that number 7-year-old should carry. "School's important, sweetheart," Rose said gently, though she understood the child's reluctance. The other children had begun to notice Maya's second-hand clothes and the way she sometimes fell asleep in class from spending nights in uncomfortable places. "Your grandfather always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you." The mention of David brought the familiar tightness to Rose's chest. Her husband had been brilliant, a mechanical genius whose innovations could have revolutionized automotive engineering. Instead, his ideas had been stolen, his patents challenged in court by companies with armies of lawyers, and his reputation destroyed by men who had the resources to bury the truth along with the dreamer who had dared to challenge their empire. Maya climbed out of the car and smoothed down her skirt with the unconscious gesture of a child who had learned that appearances mattered, even when you had little control over them. She was small for her age, with David's dark, intelligent eyes and his habit of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. But there was determination in her small frame that reminded Rose of herself at that age, the kind of strength that came from learning early that the world wasn't always fair. But that didn't mean you had to accept it quietly. The shop itself told the story of their decline. Through peeling paint and outdated equipment, what had once been David's thriving automotive research facility now served as Rose's desperate attempt to keep them housed and fed. She specialized in older cars that the fancy dealerships wouldn't touch. Vehicles owned by people who understood the value of making things last rather than constantly upgrading to the newest model. "Mrs. Chen," a hesitant voice called from the open bay door. Rose looked up to see Helen Martinez, a widow in her 70s who drove a 2001 Honda Civic that was probably worth less than some people spent on a week's vacation. The car had been making strange noises for days, and Helen had finally worked up the courage to bring it in. Though Rose suspected the real issue was loneliness rather than mechanical problems. "Good morning, Helen," Rose said warmly. "Let's see what's troubling you." As she raised the hood of the Honda, Maya drifted over to watch. The child had an extraordinary ability to diagnose automotive problems just by listening, a gift that had appeared when she was barely 5 years old. David used to joke that Maya could hear what engines were thinking, but there was truth beneath the humor. The child possessed an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that amazed even experienced mechanics. "It's the alternator belt," Maya said quietly, pointing to a component near the front of the engine. "See how it's getting fuzzy right there? That's what's making the squealing sound." Rose examined the part carefully, then nodded with approval. "You're absolutely right. Good catch, sweetheart." Helen Martinez watched this exchange with amazement. "My goodness, how does she know that?" "She has her grandfather's gift," Rose said simply. Though the words carried layers of pride and sorrow that she tried to keep from her voice, the bell chimed again, this time with enough force to rattle the glass door. 3 people in expensive suits entered, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere of the small shop. They moved with the confident stride of people accustomed to having doors opened for them and problems solved by others. The leader was a man in his 40s, tall and sharp-featured with perfectly styled silver hair and shoes that probably cost more than Rose's monthly rent. "Mrs. Chen," the man said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone who is used to being the most important person in any room. "I'm Marcus Sterling." Even Maya knew that name. Sterling Luxury Motors was the largest automotive dealership. Empire on the West Coast, with flagship locations that looked more like luxury hotels than car lots. Marcus Sterling himself was a local celebrity, the kind of businessman who appeared on magazine covers and gave speeches about innovation and success. "Mr. Sterling," Rose replied carefully, wiping her hands on a shop rag. "What brings you to our little shop?" Sterling's smile was practiced and cold, the expression of someone who had learned to project confidence without actually feeling warmth. "I'm here with some potential investors who are interested in seeing the, shall we say, full range of automotive services in Harborview, from the most cutting-edge to the most traditional." The word traditional hung in the air like an insult wrapped in politeness. Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "We provide honest service to people who need it." "I'm sure you do," Sterling said, his gaze sweeping across the shop's modest equipment and aging inventory. "Though I have to wonder how long such outdated methods can remain viable in today's market." One of the investors, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward to examine Helen's Honda. "Is this typical of your clientele?" she asked, not bothering to hide her disdain. "Vehicles that should probably be scrapped rather than repaired." Rose felt her temper beginning to rise, but before she could respond, Maya moved closer to her grandmother's side. The child's small hand slipped into Rose's work-roughened one, offering silent support that steadied the older woman's resolve. "We believe in fixing things instead of throwing them away," Rose said firmly. "Some of us think that's still worthwhile." Sterling chuckled, a sound that managed to be both jovial and condescending. "Admirable sentiment, Mrs. Chen, but hardly practical in a modern economy. Perhaps it's time to consider that progress sometimes requires leaving the past behind." The conversation was interrupted by the roar of an approaching engine, a sound that made every person in the shop turn toward the street. Through the open bay doors, they could see a car that seemed to belong to a different universe than Helen Martinez's practical Honda. The Rolls-Royce Phantom was a masterpiece of automotive engineering, its deep black paint gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning sunlight. Even at idle, the luxury sedan produced a symphony of mechanical precision that spoke of cutting-edge technology and unlimited resources. Now that, Sterling said with obvious pride, represents the future of automotive excellence. The Rolls pulled into the shop's parking area, drawing stares from passers-by who rarely saw anything more exotic than a new SUV in their neighborhood. The driver was a young man in a Sterling Motors uniform, his face flushed with panic and professional embarrassment. "Mr. Sterling," the driver called out as he climbed from the luxurious vehicle. "I'm really sorry, sir, but something's wrong with the engine. It just died on me about a mile back. I had to call for a tow." Sterling's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, revealing the sharp temper that lay beneath his polished exterior. "What do you mean something's wrong?" "This car was just serviced yesterday." "I don't know, sir. It was running fine. Then it just lost power and shut down. Won't restart at all." The investors exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from mild interest to concern. A malfunctioning $500,000 luxury sedan was not the kind of advertisement that Sterling Motors wanted to present to potential partners. "Well," Sterling said, his voice tight with controlled frustration, "I suppose we'll have to call my head technician to come take a look." Rose watched this drama unfold with the detached interest of someone who had seen enough automotive emergencies to know that expensive cars could fail just as dramatically as affordable ones. But Maya had moved closer to the Rolls-Royce, her head tilted in that characteristic pose that meant she was processing something complex. "That's a beautiful car," Helen Martinez said diplomatically, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. "It's more than beautiful," Sterling replied, his pride overriding his embarrassment. "It's a marvel of modern engineering, computer-controlled. Everything. Adaptive systems, predictive maintenance protocols. There's probably more processing power in that vehicle than in most people's homes." Maya continued to study the Rolls-Royce, her young face serious with concentration. She walked slowly around the car, pausing occasionally as if listening to something only she could hear. The adults watched her with varying degrees of amusement and puzzlement. Maya Rose said gently, "Don't get too close to Mr. Sterling's car." But Maya had stopped near the front of the Rolls-Royce, her head tilted at an angle that Rose recognized. It was the same expression David used to get when he was working through a particularly complex problem. The look of someone whose mind was racing far ahead of what their mouth could express. "I know what's wrong with it," Maya said quietly. The adults turned to look at her. Sterling's expression shifted from annoyance to condescending amusement. "I'm sorry. What did you say, little girl?" Maya straightened up, meeting his gaze with the direct honesty that only children could manage. "I said I know what's wrong with your car. The computer is getting confused because one of its sensors is lying to it." Sterling laughed, a sound that held no warmth at all. "Confused? Engines don't get confused, child. They either work or they don't. This one's getting mixed signals," Maya continued, undaunted by the dismissive tone. "The system that controls the engine is reading wrong information, so it's shutting everything down to protect itself." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the ticking of cooling metal from Helen's Honda. Sterling stared at Maya with an expression caught between disbelief and irritation, while his investors watched the exchange with the fascination of people witnessing something completely unexpected. "That's quite an imagination you have there," Sterling said finally, his voice dripping with patronizing amusement. "But I think we'll leave the diagnostics to qualified professionals." Rose felt a familiar surge of protective anger at Sterling's dismissive tone, but Maya seemed unaffected by the slight. She simply nodded and stepped back from the Rolls-Royce, though her attention remained focused on something that had caught her interest. Sterling pulled out his phone and began dialing. "I'm calling my head technician," he announced to the group. James Parker has 25 years of experience with luxury vehicles. He'll have this sorted out in no time. As they waited for the technician to arrive, the atmosphere in the shop grew increasingly tense. Sterling paced near his disabled luxury sedan while his investors made polite conversation with Helen Martinez about the reliability of older vehicles. Rose returned to work on the Honda, and Maya settled into a corner with her school backpack, pulling out a worn notebook and beginning to sketch. 20-5 minutes later, a Sterling Motors service truck pulled up outside the shop, followed by a gleaming white diagnostic van that served as the company's mobile repair unit. James Parker emerged from the truck with the confident swagger of someone who had built his reputation on solving impossible problems. "Mr. Sterling," James said with professional respect. "Sorry it took so long to get here. Traffic was terrible coming through downtown. Just figure out what's wrong with my car." Sterling replied curtly, "We have important business to discuss, and this delay is becoming embarrassing." James nodded and approached the Rolls-Royce with the systematic thoroughness of an experienced diagnostician. He connected a laptop to the car's diagnostic port and began running through a series of electronic tests, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Computers showing multiple error codes," he announced after several minutes. "Engine management system, power distribution, even the adaptive suspension is throwing faults. It's like every system in the car decided to have a breakdown at the same time." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Well, fix it." "I'm trying, sir, but I've never seen anything like this. All the individual components test fine, but something's making the main computer think there's a catastrophic failure when there isn't one." From her corner, Maya looked up from her sketchpad. She had been drawing the Rolls-Royce, but her version showed internal components that shouldn't have been visible from the outside engine blocks. Wiring harnesses and complex electronic modules rendered with startling accuracy for a 7-year-old's. Artwork, Rose noticed her granddaughter's intense focus on the diagnostic process and felt a familiar mixture of pride and concern. Maya's abilities were undeniable, but they also set her apart from other children in ways that could be both blessing and burden. James continued his diagnostic routine, checking connections and running system tests with increasing frustration. "I'm going to have to call the regional tech center," he finally admitted. "This is beyond anything I've seen before." "How long will that take?" Sterling demanded. "Could be hours, sir. Maybe longer if they have to bring in a specialist from the factory." The investors were beginning to look uncomfortable, and Sterling's carefully orchestrated demonstration of automotive superiority was rapidly turning into a public embarrassment. His face was flushed with a combination of anger and shame that made his practiced charm seem brittle and forced. Maya closed her sketchpad and stood up, brushing dust from her school uniform. She walked over to where James was working, her small figure dwarfed by the hulking diagnostic equipment. "Excuse me, mister," she said politely, "but you're looking in the wrong place." James glanced down at her with the tolerant smile that adults often gave to children who wanted to help with grown-up tasks. "That's okay, sweetheart. This is pretty complicated stuff." "I know," Maya replied seriously, "but the problem isn't in the computer. It's in the sensor that tells the computer what to think." Sterling had overheard this exchange, and his expression darkened with irritation. "For heaven's sake, does everyone in this place think they're an automotive expert?" But James was looking at Maya with new interest. He had worked with enough vehicles to know that sometimes the most obvious solutions came from unexpected sources, and there was something about the child's calm certainty that caught his attention. "What sensor are you talking about?" he asked seriously. Maya pointed to a specific area near the front of the Rolls-Royce, her small finger indicating a location that wasn't immediately visible from their current angle. "The one that measures airflow to the engine. It's giving wrong numbers, so the computer thinks the whole system is dangerous and shuts everything down to be safe." The silence that followed was profound. James stared at the 7-year-old girl who had just described a diagnostic scenario that hadn't occurred to him, while Sterling's face went through a series of expressions that ranged from disbelief to outrage. "That's ridiculous," Sterling said finally. "A child can't possibly understand the complexities of modern automotive systems." But James was already moving toward the front of the Rolls-Royce, his diagnostic tablet in hand. "Actually, sir, what she's describing makes perfect sense. If the mass airflow sensor is giving false readings, it would cause exactly the kind of cascade failure we're seeing." He connected his equipment to a different diagnostic port and began running tests that he hadn't tried before. Within minutes, his expression changed from skepticism to amazement. "I'll be damned," he muttered, staring at his screen. "She's absolutely right. The mass airflow sensor is reading 40% high, making the computer think there's a dangerous lean condition. That's why everything's shutting down." The group gathered around James's diagnostic display, watching as the data confirmed Maya's analysis with mathematical precision. The child had correctly identified a problem that had baffled an experienced technician, using nothing more than observation and intuitive understanding. Asterisk. "How did you know that?" James asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than condescension. Maya shrugged, the gesture of a child who couldn't fully explain something that came naturally to her. "The engine sounds scared when it's getting bad information, like it wants to work but doesn't know if it's safe." Sterling was staring at Maya with an expression that had shifted from dismissive amusement to something approaching shock. The little girl in the wrinkled school uniform had just accomplished something that his highly paid technician couldn't manage, and she had done it with a simplicity that made his complex diagnostic equipment seem almost primitive. "Fine," he said finally, his voice carrying an edge of challenge that bordered on cruelty. "If you're so smart, little girl, why don't you fix it?" The words hung in the air like a dare that everyone knew was meant to humiliate rather than encourage. Rose stepped forward, her protective instincts flaring. But Maya was already looking up at Sterling with those serious dark eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "Okay," she said simply. "I will." Maya walked to the front of the Rolls-Royce with the confident stride of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through. But instead of heading toward the engine bay or the diagnostic ports that James had been using, she knelt down near the front wheel well and began examining an area that seemed completely unrelated to the car's electronic problems. "What are you looking for?" James asked, his curiosity overcoming his skepticism. "The sensor that's confused," Maya replied without looking up. "It's not where you'd expect it to be because my grandfather designed it to be protected from road damage and heat buildup." The casual mention of her grandfather's involvement in the Rolls-Royce's design sent a ripple of shock through the assembled adults. Sterling opened his mouth to object, then closed it again as he realized that challenging the child's knowledge would only invite more uncomfortable questions. Maya's small fingers traced along what appeared to be standard bodywork, but after a moment, she found something that made her smile. "There," she said with satisfaction. "The access panel is hidden right here." She pressed against a section of the car's body that looked identical to everything around it. And to everyone's amazement, a small panel popped open to reveal a cluster of electronic components nestled inside the vehicle's structure. Even James leaned forward with professional interest, clearly surprised by the discovery of a service access that wasn't marked in any of his technical manuals. "How did you know that was there?" he asked. Maya's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of a child stating something obvious. "Because my grandpa told me that good engineers always make things easy to fix, even if they have to hide the easy part to keep it safe." Inside the hidden compartment, several sensors and electronic modules were nestled among carefully routed wiring harnesses. Maya studied them with intense focus, her small hands hovering over components without actually touching them. "That one," she said, pointing to a sensor no bigger than a matchbox. "See how it has that green stuff on the connections? That's what's making it give wrong numbers to the computer." James moved closer to examine the component she had indicated, his professional eye immediately recognizing the telltale signs of corrosion on the electrical contacts. "You're absolutely right," he said with amazement. "That's exactly what would cause the symptoms we're seeing." Working together, James and Maya carefully cleaned the corroded sensor and reconnected it to the car's systems. When they finally sealed the access panel and James ran his diagnostic tests, the Rolls-Royce's computers came online with the smooth precision of a machine that knew exactly what it was supposed to do. The luxury sedan started with a purr of perfectly calibrated mechanical harmony. The car that had been dead and silent an hour earlier was now running with the confident smoothness of a $500,000 engineering masterpiece. Sterling approached the Rolls-Royce with an expression that cycled through disbelief, grudging, respect, and something that might have been fear. He had just witnessed a 7-year-old girl accomplish something that his experienced technician couldn't manage, using knowledge that she shouldn't have possessed. "Well," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "I suppose I owe you an apology, young lady." But Maya's response would change everything Sterling thought he knew about his business empire. "Mr. Sterling," she said, with the formal politeness that children used when addressing authority figures, "why did you tell people that my grandpa's ideas were yours?" The question hit Sterling like a physical blow. His face went pale as he stared down at the child who had just exposed a secret he had spent years trying to bury. "Your grandfather?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "David Chen," Rose said, quietly stepping forward to place a protective hand on Maya's shoulder. "My husband was David Chen." The name hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be denied. David Chen had been the brilliant engineer whose revolutionary automotive innovations had supposedly been developed by Sterling's research division. The patents, the safety systems, the efficiency protocols that had made Sterling Motors billions of dollars. All of it had been stolen from a man who had died believing his life's work had been taken from him. "That's impossible," Sterling said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, it's not," Maya replied with the direct honesty of childhood. "Grandpa left me things, important papers and ownership stuff. He said when I turn 8 next month, I'll own more of your company than you do." The revelation hit Sterling like lightning. His empire, his fortune, his reputation, all of it had been built on innovations stolen from David Chen. And now, Chen's granddaughter was about to inherit the legal power to take it all away. Sterling's legs gave out, and he sank onto a nearby chair as the full implications of Maya's inheritance became clear. The little girl who had just fixed his car with knowledge she shouldn't have possessed was about to become the majority owner of his company. "You're David Chen's granddaughter," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a man watching his world collapse. "Yes," Maya said simply. "And in 3 weeks, I'm going to make sure everyone knows that my grandpa was the smartest engineer in the world. And that you've been telling lies about his work for a very long time." As the truth finally came to light in the small garage where dreams had once been crushed by corporate greed, it became clear that sometimes justice took the form of a 7-year-old girl with dirt under her fingernails and the courage to speak truth to power, the CEO who had dared a poor little girl to fix his broken Rolls-Royce had discovered that she owned the company that had stolen her grandfather's legacy. And now, David Chen's greatest innovation wasn't automotive technology, it was the granddaughter who would carry forward his belief that helping people was more important than personal profit. In the end, Maya Chen would grow up knowing that she was the keeper of more than just automotive patents. She was the guardian of values that could change the world, one honest repair at a time.
Hit subscribe and keep watching. More stories waiting for you. Tap the video on screen. Just click and enjoy.